I lived in Mossman. We had a lot of association with the P&O and Orient Line ships. My mother married my father when he was a radio officer with Marconi in a P&O ship. And he came out here. He loved the sea, always had a focus on the ships that were coming and going. So there was always a focus on seafaring things in our family. And it wasn't just the firing guns or firing torpedoes. It was the whole ethos of the sea that I enjoyed. We lived at George's Heights, near overlooking the harbour. In fact, we overlooked Middle Harbour, but we had to have our air raid shelter. And on the night that the Japanese submarines came into the harbour, there was a gunfire. We went into our shelter until my grandmother said, "I've had enough of this," and she went off to make a cup of tea. But we were always exposed to the happenings on the harbour. And I can remember once going up to George's Heights to see the departure of the Queen Elizabeth, and it was either the Mauretania or the Aquitania, taking the 6th Division, and standing in the offing, coming into Sydney through the heads, was the Queen Elizabeth. If I failed to get into the Navy, I wanted to go to sea. And indeed, I failed getting into the Naval College at the age of 13 and didn't go until I was a special entry, supply entry, at the age of 17. And if I'd failed that, I would have been quite happy to go into the Merchant Navy. I wanted to go to sea. The love of the Royal Navy was nurtured in us. And so I was very lucky. When we left Naval College, at the age of 17, we left to serve with the Royal Navy for 3.5 years because we didn't have a fleet big enough to give us the range of experience. Our main focus was on learning our naval skills. It wasn't until we, having finished with the training cruiser, we were promoted to midshipman, and we went off to join our ships. And this was by then 1950. And China was becoming a bit of a menace, threatened to Hong Kong. The Chinese communists had defeated the nationalists. We were to be the flagship of the British East Indies fleet, a light cruiser, HMS Ceylon. We were working up in the Med, and then we had to go through the Mediterranean. We had to stop in Aden to pick up our Somali seamen and stokers. Now this is, the Royal Navy in those days had locally engaged crews. We had the Admiral's family embarked, and we were about to take them to East Africa, and after that we were going to do a cruise visiting Indian ports. And out of the blue, the Korean War broke out. The British heavy cruiser Belfast was due to finish its commission, and the Royal Navy didn't want to leave the Far East Fleet one cruiser short, so we were told we were going to the Far East Fleet. No mention of the fact that we might be going to Korea. But as the time approached for our transfer, it became quite apparent that we were destined for Korea, and we went to Singapore to do a refit. Ostensibly, we were heading back to Trincomalee. So we left and turned up the strait, Malacca Strait, and then overnight reversed course and went off to Hong Kong. And there we were joined by HMS Warramunga, which was coming up to relieve Shoalhaven, I think. And they joined us, and we took off from Hong Kong to go to Korea. And we were, I suppose, one day out, and we were hauled back because the Americans had said to the Brits that they'd been pushed into the Pusan perimeter. And they said, "Can you help us with reinforcements?" So the Brits very quickly put together a brigade from the garrison force in Hong Kong, and the 1st Battalion, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, came to us in HMS Ceylon, and away we went, escorted by Warramunga, and off we went to action stations when we were going through the Formosa Strait, and we were joined there by HMAS Bataan, which was already on station and came down to join us. I was very proud of these two Australian destroyers, and the Brits said, my word, they were well handled. On the 15th of September was the landing at Inchon. We were escorting HMS Triumph, which was flying off aircraft, and we were part of the cover force for the landing. We weren't actually in the bombardment force, but there wasn't a lot of that. And we were the replacement cruiser if anything happened to one of the others. And it was a very exciting time. We could just see masses of landing craft going in towards the shore. We were well off, so they were still on passage. They weren't. We didn't see them being opposed in their landing. There was a threat from air. The main threat was from mines, because the North Koreans released mines down the rivers, and in the conventions of war, mines are supposed to be tethered. These were either released in the rivers or dropped over the side by sampans. And ships had been damaged. I think one American destroyer was sunk, hitting a mine. So that was the main threat during the summer days. And then we went round onto the east coast, and we bombarded a place called Chongjin, which is very close to the Russian border. And we were there with a force of USS Missouri, some American heavy cruisers. We, the light cruisers and the destroyers, were inshore, bombarding. We were probably as far north as anybody ever got in the Korean War. The Royal Navy, thinking that the war was over, withdrew its ships. They were going back to Hong Kong for Christmas. We, being East Indies Fleet, had nowhere to go to, so they said, well, you stay up there just in case anything happens. And we went to Kure through the Shimonoseki Strait, and we were doing a refit, and the two Australian destroyers, Bataan and Warramunga, were with us, and we picked up messages saying they've identified Chinese people in the ground forces attacking. This was at the end of October, and it became quite evident that China had entered the war with volunteer forces. The Americans and the British Commonwealth force were in retreat, and the main retreat was towards Hungnam on the east coast, but a large section were coming through Pyongyang to a place called Chenampo on the Taedong River. We were to go up there and assist the evacuation. Took off to Sasebo, were briefed by the US Navy, and our captain said he was taking charge of the situation off the mouth of the Taedong River. And we were there. There were 3 Canadian destroyers, 2 Australian destroyers, our light cruiser, and 1 American destroyer. And they were to go up the Taedong River to help with the evacuation. The rivers were very badly surveyed. Indeed, Warramunga went aground at a time where there should have been meters underneath its hull, and a Canadian destroyer got into trouble. So people prevailed on our captain not to go up. But the other force of Cayuga, Athabascan, I think it was, and Forest Royal, the Canadian, and Bataan. Bataan got up there. They covered the evacuation of people. The huge force of junks came down the river, and then they just bombarded and destroyed the port of Chinampo. And then we were into a different phase of the war because the Chinese had come in, and it was the onset of the winter. Appalling winter conditions were building up. We got snow flurries at that time. The soldiers ashore had a miserable time. If their hands touched the metal of their rifles, they froze to the metal of the rifles. And it was so cold that we had to move our close-range weapons overnight in elevation and just to stop the lubricating oil from freezing. It was desperately cold. And that prevailed. It was the coldest winter of the century. So we were gradually being pushed back. We saw this fleet of junks and being escorted further south, and they had to keep an eye on some of those because there were infiltrators amongst those. But then we proceeded into Inchon, and we were there early December, and we were told to expect a huge Chinese attack over that time. The Americans wanted a phalanx of artillery right across the Korean peninsula, and they wanted the warships filling in the gaps between the islands. So we were there waiting for the onslaught to come. It didn't happen, but they continued to push south. They took Seoul. Incheon was exposed. The Americans had huge supplies in Incheon, which they'd landed there, and they were all being destroyed. We could see fires and explosions as all this stuff was being destroyed. We continued on into early January, staying there. We stayed there until the place was overrun. We were 20 miles behind the front line, and so we had to withdraw. We were the last ship out of Incheon. It was an interesting time. Morale was rock bottom because we felt isolated. The British fleet had gone back to Hong Kong. You could almost feel the malevolence of this huge colossus of China. No lights anywhere. We felt very remote. We hadn't gone back for Christmas. We had been at sea for a very long time, and messages came through that we'd been mentioned on the news and we were going to get a medal. Morale picked up enormously. And this is one of the messages that have stayed with me ever since, and I tell it whenever I'm telling a story about military life. Recognition is so important. It is important for morale, as it was then, in time of war, and in old age, it's important for the peace of mind of veterans. This is another thing that important to remember for the war. A lot of the people that went to Korea were just, especially in the army, were 3 years only. They came back from that and very much influenced by the experience of their elder brothers and fathers and uncles. We've been to a war. In the Second World War, people tend to diminish, to discredit their exposure. And that had a terrible effect on their peace of mind. They felt as though they'd been rejected by their own people. We in the regular forces said, okay, that's over, on with our career. So our focus from there on was our career, doing courses, passing exams, getting promotion if we could. So I just went about my naval duties, very proud of the fact that when I could meet up with my father's contemporaries, they said, "You've been to a war." And that made me very proud. I joined that noble company of Australians that had been to a war.